Hello and welcome to the Anime Ramblin' Boys podcast. I am one of your hosts, Tropical Robot, aka the artist formerly known as Riki. What happened to Riki? Some say that in this post-coronavirus world, he is quarantined, that is, doing some social distancing in another world. And these are my co-hosts.
Hey, what up, everybody? I'm Bass. I swear to God, before watching this show, it really opened my eyes up to showing me that I have never touched an MMORPG in my life.
Hey y'all, it's Texas Ranger, and I swear that I have touched too many RPGs in my life.
And I'm Silver. I've also touched way too many MMOs and RPGs in my life, and I am also a true advocate of gender equality.
Ooh, just like our boy Kazuma. Okay, so this week we are, as some folks have alluded to, covering Konosuba. And so to begin with, I actually want to do that thing we normally do and ask folks, what were your general impressions of the show, gentlemen?
Okay, I'll start. So, from the get-go, I have a pretty biased opinion about Konosuba, not so much because I have an affinity towards comedy, because my life is a joke, but because Konosuba came in a really, low point in my life, and I just needed, a really, good pick-me-up anime, and it just fell on my lap. I was like, oh, I've heard about this for a long time, let me watch it. And I binged the entire show in the span of 2 days. And then I've proceeded to read the actual, web novel. So I really, it's really near and dear to my heart. It's really endearing. It's really funny. One of the best, I'm not going to call it pure comedy. Just, it's a funny anime. We're going to get into what kind of comedy it is in a second. Characters are great. Story is the story. The characters are just amazing. Everyone is wonderful. Darkness is best girl, but YunYun is followed as a very close second. As a base may
I served
agree.
the Soviet.
I served the
Soviet Union.
I served the Soviet
YunYun
Union. And,
Is best
yeah.
girl.
What about you, Base?
Okay, so I came into Konosuba kind of knowing that, both you guys have heavily recommended it. Everyone said it's I've seen a lot of discourse on it. Obviously, it kind of passed me by because at the time, I don't know, I just wasn't really watching comedy / satire / isekai anime like that. So, when I first watched this show, there were just some parts that I did not like. I was just oof. It's me, guys. I'm the one. I'm gonna be that guy. I even came into this weekend fearing oh my god, these guys are gonna hate me. Since then, and after having a little bit more discussion, look at discourse, I've mellowed out, and I still think it's okay. The parts that are funny to me are still funny to me, and then the parts that I dislike have not ruined the show for me. But personally, at this point, I wouldn't say I would rewatch it as anything other than a clips compilation of the best parts. So that's the point I'm coming from.
And you, Texas Ranger?
So I've seen a lot of comedy isekai such as Digimon, Sword Art Online, and everyone's favorite. The time I got reincarnated as a slime, and I think I really love his characters that it's brought. It's clever. I've seen it a lot. I've watched the OVAs, I watched the episodes, and I've really been sticking with it. Compared to all those isekais and just others that I have on my mind, I think overall it's pretty funny. It's fun, and just overall it really brought a lot to the table, and I think it was great.
And as for me, it's also very interesting to note that Texas Ranger, I was the one who introduced you to this back when we were roommates senior year of college. And I remember your reaction of full of mirth and enjoyment at this show. As for my buddy Silver, I hear that 100%. I think I had a very similar initial reaction to Konosuba, partly because, and it's interesting because this is actually something that we will be speaking about to a certain degree during this podcast. But I also stumbled upon Konosuba at a time in my life when, I was sort of on, I don't know, how would you put this? Not in like the greatest headspace in the world, somewhat sad, melancholic, if you will. And Konosuba, I remember very clearly that I binged it while I was in the airport waiting for a flight to go home to Puerto Rico. And this is around the time that, interestingly enough, also around the time that I watched Fate Zero, I think, or I'm not entirely sure, to be completely honest with you. Actually, it was. Yeah, it was. So it was indeed around that time when I was kind of overburdened with, my senior research project. And this came into my life, interestingly enough, at the same time as a tragedy. And those were two animes that kind of helped fill me with like meaning. So Konosuba means a lot to me personally, interestingly enough, because this is going to relate to a conversation we're going to have later on in this podcast episode. And I just realized that.
Dang. I just want to say, it's like, I'm glad all of y'all have this special moment where this show reached out and really touched you. I really do feel left out, because it's like, oh, I just kind of watched it like, oh yeah, it's an anime, I'm going to put it on the weekend, and I was just sitting in my room in a very normal like lens, and yeah, that's something we're going to discuss later, but it was just sort of like, all right, everyone tells me it's a masterpiece, let's get started, and then I was just like, oh no, it's not happening. I'm not feeling things.
Trust us, it's not the enemy, it's you.
It's me, guys. Don't worry, listeners, fellow podcasters, it's me. I've accepted it.
Oh,
right.
Don't worry, Bass. It wasn't even super emotional for me either.
Oh, no.
I was really just finished drinking and then saw King of the Hill.
Sometimes the system fails us, Bobby.
Something ain't right with that boy.
Okay.
Wait, one more thing about
All
general
right.
impressions before we get into characters and all that. Something that to me sets this anime apart from others, particularly comedy isekai or other comedy isekai. The soundtrack is just like adds so much to like the humor and comedy of the show that for others doesn't really. Like the other soundtracks, forgettable, C tier. Konosuba soundtrack, I could be walking around downtown with it playing and I'm just having a great time.
Yeah, I'll agree. The two OPs, I found them on Spotify. They're in my anime playlist. They're pretty good. The presentation of the material itself is of quality, of a pretty high quality too. So I can appreciate that as well.
I have filmed myself and put on my Snapchat story a video of me studying while listening to one of the OPs. Okay, so moving into character analyses, which is going to be the first part of this podcast. What did folks think about the main cast to start off? We can always start off with everybody's favorite person to hate, aka Aqua.
I'll let Bass take it away.
Let me tell you, I'm a simple man. I don't require much. When there's a character who you just every time, I don't think of myself as a hateful person, but every time this person, this creature came on screen, my internal temperature went up at least 10 degrees. And it didn't start out that way. At first I was just like, oh, she's the joke character. And then after a while, I was talking to another one of my friends who had watched it, and he was like, oh, you're supposed to hate her. And I'm like, okay. But then every single, progressive scene, it was just like, she just got worse and worse and worse for me. And I don't think I ever personally reached that point of oh, I'm supposed to hate her. No, there were just so many moments where it's just like, oh, but she gets her comeuppance in the end. And I'm like, yes, but she doesn't learn. If this person existed in real life and I was in a group of friends, and yeah, at some points they show that, oh, none of the characters can exist without the other characters. But no, I would actively be like, this Aqua chick is like cancerous. Like, dump her, leave her behind. You do not need her. She causes all the problems, like 90% of the problems. The other problems are like character flaws that the individual characters have, but a lot of the problems only exist because Aqua exists. And I just don't understand the fascination. She's just the worst. And not in that like, oh, it's the worst. No, like, I actually dislike her as a part of the show. I think her alone is like 80% of my critiques of liking the show.
So for me, it's interesting to note, this is again a conversation we'll have a little bit later, in terms of whether or not one can evaluate Konosuba on the basis that we've evaluated other shows. But I think if there are traces of themes in Konosuba, one of those themes is wish fulfillment, and kind of like the show itself kind of making a statement. I don't even know if it's necessarily making a statement, but just sort of like challenging like the conventional idea of like wish fulfillment potentially. And with Aqua, it's possible to see her as someone. It's very interesting because her central like wish is to be treated as a goddess, but everything that she does undermines her sort of like divine, above like the common folk status. She just ends up coming across as like out of touch and as like insufferable is the word that comes to mind.
Watch Aqua,
but to comedic effect.
Watch Aqua walk up to me and tell me she's a goddess. Girl, I will sock you.
Something that I was thinking about, in terms of like the whole narrative, like the wish fulfillment, her wanting to be treated as a goddess, I think her arguably biggest personality trait is just how dumb she is. Because I brought it up before. In the world, they established it from the first episode, those adventure cards cannot be forged. And Aqua's literally says that she's a goddess. So all that it would take for people to believe that she's a goddess is to show them the card, but she's too stupid to realize it.
Yeah, I remember they did mention she has below average intelligence, and I'm like, okay, sure. I know some people who would consider themselves not the most clever people. They're pretty humble, you know. The problem is she has this below average intelligence, but doesn't realize her own limit. I can't go on like this.
I'll add one more thing to her like below average intelligence. It's worse than that. She is so dumb that anyone who believes in her cult automatically gets a downgrade to their intelligence just for believing in Aqua.
Oh, oof. My God.
She literally has a god complex.
Because she is a goddess. I will push back on one thing. She isn't completely useless, and like they cannot survive without her for the simple fact that she is Cosmo's get out of jail free card. Like without Aqua, he can't be revived. They've explicitly said that.
Just gonna come in right quick. Why does he want to get revived anyway? Can't Eris just send him home?
I mean, he totally could, but it's
we'll
like
talk about
from
that
the
later.
both times in the anime that like, oh, I'm not counting the movie, that Kazuma dies, he explicitly kind of like infers that like he prefers this world over the other one.
And that's why every time he dies, he's like, no, I should definitely go back. And I'm like, go home. Do it, king. Rise up. You don't need these people.
Rise up to what? He was a shut-in meat in Japan.
He dies from accidentally dodging a car.
Let's go into Cosmo.
The tractor.
Let's go into Cosmo. This king, you know, this stand-up guy, this man Cosmo. I'm so glad that, like, you know, he oftentimes is like the straight man to the absurdities going around, because his reactions to a lot of things are like great and perfect. Yeah, he has his moments too, like whenever he's bragging about his actual adventure things, and I'm just like, man, if you were just like a little less braggadocious, you might be able to make it into this world. He's a good main character for this series. I actually do enjoy him going around, and he does actually think about his luck and his ability to utilize his teammates and all that stuff. And as I said before, his comedic timing sometimes, and I've watched both, like some of the dub and some of the sub, but there are definitely times where people are like, Cosmo. He's like, yep, that's me. And he's just talking in the background while someone else is ranting on, and I'm just like, oh, comedic king right here.
So one thing I wanted to bring up about Aqua before I talk about Kazuma is that it's funny you mentioned wish fulfillment tropical, because Aqua is literally there because she was a wish. And now going back to Cosmo. So Cosmo is not your everyday protagonist in isekais. Others usually rely on skills. They're overpowered. Like we look at Kirito and things like that. But Cosmo literally came in and maxed out his luck stat. And he uses his wits. And he really breaks the mold on what it means to be like the usual main character. Like he doesn't have always the honorable things and is not always the best type of person. But do y'all remember that Toad episode?
My man took on 2 toads first day. Let's not forget that he got some powers. He's smart. When he was when he learned his thief skill and he uses it as his high luck to acquire some valuable merchandise from some of the patrons and regular folk around. He's a thinking man.
Ooh, in terms of like you brought up an interesting thing about like what he relies on as compared to other isekai main characters. Luck, all that. But something that gets like it's touched a little bit upon at the end of season 2, but more so later on in the story, money. He relies on money to get through his problems. And it becomes like a characteristic of his. He becomes so wealthy that he just throws money at a problem.
The amount of times though where it's like, oh, you can finally get out of debt, and then a little blue-haired person comes around and is just like, oh, why don't we get drinks for everybody? And I'm like, no, how about we not? Why are you here? Go away.
As far as my views on Kazuma, again, I'll continue that sort of thread with like wish fulfillment. It's interesting with him that he does want to be a hero. He does want to be seen as a hero. That's like at least part of why he's in this world. And yet, he very much like embodies qualities that we do not associate with heroism, and that in fact are typically associated with vice. For example, he is a tremendously lustful individual, and beyond being tremendously lustful, he's somewhat sadistic. That's another quality of his. And as Silver mentioned, it seems like he also is, or will be in the future, unhesitant to, kind of use money, wealth to like resolve his problems, which is like quite interesting to note that, as far as like the wish fulfillment pseudo theme goes.
My man's just trying to live his life. Let my man breathe.
And you can't forget that he's a advocate of true gender equality. He has no problems drop kicking a woman.
Honestly, that's probably like the 3rd funniest joke in the show. I love it every time someone comes in. It's like, this is Scumzama or whatever, and he is an advocate of true gender equality.
Kazuma trash. Yeah, no, don't get me wrong. I love my boy Kazuma, man. He's funny as shit.
I think I love him so much also because of like how he compares to other isekai main characters. He's just such a breath of fresh air. He's like genuine, and in the show alone, like compared to the other guy, like Mitsurugi or whatever his name is, he is supposed to be like the counter. He's supposed to be like the perfect like Kirito kind of character. And like even the characters in the show were like, he's boring, he's shitty, blah 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 blah. They prefer Kazuma.
Admittedly, the second that man came on screen and he was like, I challenge you, I'm like, I know where this is gonna go. Like immediately. He's gonna take the sword, isn't he? Oh, look at that. He took the sword. Oh, look at that. He won. And the cheerleader girls are yelling at him. Oh.
Interesting point of contrast between Kazuma and Mitsurugi. So Mitsurugi's a simp. I think we can all agree on that.
Yeah.
He simps. He simps Aqua. Hardcore.
I don't know why.
And an interesting thing is that in some ways, Kazuma in his relations with like the women in his party treats them more as like human beings than Mitsurugi treats like Aqua. Because Mitsurugi treats Aqua as like an object, as like, he puts her on a pedestal.
As a
and,
goddess.
but he denies her agency, which is
Yeah,
like an
he
interesting
does.
thing.
A really funny note about Mitsurugi is like, remember, his weapon that he chose or his item was the sword. That means this man died in real life Japan with that set of armor on. He died wearing that.
Right. Oh my god.
And he just stuck wearing that he just has to... What the man was doing, I have no idea.
Basically, I guess... my thing to-
Megumi.
Oh.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I was going to say,
ahead.
to wrap up Kozma. Kozma would definitely be someone I would love to interact with and, like, be like, oh, you're a person I know. I'm pretty sure I could get into misadventures with you. Would I ever trust you to do anything? Hell no.
I'll push back a little bit on that last critique about, like, him, like, not being trustworthy. Because, like, in the show, like, it's kind of implied, and, like, it's definitely much, much more so later on, that, like, for all of his faults, and there's, like, millions of them, everyone always relies on him to get the job done at the end of the day, because, like, they rely on him to get it done. So that is actually the thing. He is reliable. They view him as reliable.
I wouldn't believe he's trustworthy that he'll betray me. It's more along the lines of, like, I want to make sure my hands are in every part of this operation. I don't want to be left in the dark with you around. Just saying. Just keep me abreast, bro.
That's fair. But it's not even not so much him, but like also you gotta remember that he has the highest luck out of any living human in the world at this moment, but Aqua has the lowest. So the reason why the party always runs into all these weird situations, they're always like basically like on their ass, is because of Aqua's luck. It is literally all because of her.
So you're telling me it's her fault?
Yes, literally every problem in this world can literally be brought back to Aqua. It is a running joke later on.
Please stop.
All right.
Don't give me more ammo. Let's move on.
let's move on to Megumi.
行きます。我が究極の破壊魔法。エクセプラージャ。
I love Megami.
So, love Megami. She might be a glass canyon with her explosive magic. She'll hit you with one shot, but that one shot's gonna take it all out.
She's definitely the internet's favorite girl, and it's funny because watching the show, I recognized her from that like one Gigunk waifu ad from like a while ago that I had no idea who this person was, and I was just like, oh, this ad's kind of funny, but like, who is this person? Then I watched the show and I was like, oh, it's you. And the internet definitely loves her. She's good, like, for her jokes and stuff. I didn't love her, but that's just me, though. Like, she's great. She's fine. She's good.
Yeah, so I guess with her, as far as like the wish fulfillment things goes, there's two things that come into my mind. The first is that she wants to be the master of this like incredibly powerful form of magic, explosion magic. And yet the trade-off that she has to make in order to wield that is to become completely impotent and powerless immediately after using it. And then the other level to it, I think one could say, is that, and we see this whenever she, is like partying with like Kazuma, Darkness, and Aqua, and she wants to like drink alcohol or whatever. I think that's like an example of like the broader like set of, I guess, phenomena where she wants to be treated as like an adult, but her attitude is like in direct opposition to that desire, because it is literally like the embodiment of the chuuni trope, which is like very funny in that way.
Which is something I had to look up. So like 90% of the jokes about like small mage girl who wants to be seen as older in RPG kind of just went over my head. I was more just laughing at, oh, this Megami person's, she's not dumb, she's pretty smart. Like when she tricked Cosmo into letting her into the party, and her introduction as a Crimson Demon, I was like, oh, look at this theatrics. I can get behind this.
Oh yeah, her intelligence is one thing. Like Crimson Demons are like canonically like really highly intelligent. It's just that she's really smart, but she's also very immature. That's what offsets it a lot of the time. I also love Megami because she has a kitty.
The cat's cute. It's good. Yeah.
The cat gets its own arc later.
The cat's name is like
Chomosuke
Chomika?
or something like that.
Chumosuke.
Oh yeah, Megami also gets away with naming all the silly things around. And I remember when it's like, yeah, Crimson Demons have really weird names for things, and I'm like, sure, these are pretty hilarious and pretty out there names, but they're not like. When I heard weird, I was expecting like random Q's and V's to be dropped in, but then again, it originally comes from a different language, so that's probably why it's something different in the original Japanese. That's like something so abstract that I'm just not getting as like an English watcher. Okay, can we actually talk about like the best person in this party?
Take it away, take it away.
My girl, Darkness.
ぜひ私をぜひこの私をパーティーにお断りします即断だと
Who is like 1A, 1B for best girl with another character. We'll talk about it later. But like Darkness, the second this person stepped on screen, I was just like, oh, I get it. I know the jokes. And yeah, sure, the jokes is that she's she's like a masochist and is just really into like terrible things happening to her. But the amount of like cut-ins of her just like falling back blushing whenever someone like slightly rebukes her just gets me every time. But I think the funnier part is that like she's doing these blatant things and exclaiming these desires in a way that's just like obviously like not the most like healthy thing, and everyone around her for the most part is just like, oh my god, she's so brave and strong and everything. Like remember her fight with the Duahan where she kept saying all these terrible things he was going to do to her, and he's just over here being like, stop, people are gonna get the wrong impression. I was dying. And number two, the funniest like part of the 2 seasons for me was everything to do with her family when they went back there, and she was just it was prime. It was A+. Darkness is a monster material. I'm like, oof, I want a person like this in my life. Not for the reasons that most people would think. No, I don't need that. I just need the jokes. I just need to see this in action.
Darkness's speech in season 2 about what her ideal man and living situation is arguably top 5 greatest anime speeches of all time. Hands down, top 5. Right up there with like Lelouch of Code Geass and all of them.
I felt inspired to be a better person. I was like, I need to work on myself. The passion that this individual has is something that like, I'm like, where is it? Where is it in my life? What am I striving for? I am worthless. I am not worthy. Yeah, so Darkness is great. Also, she's kind of a get out of jail free card for a lot of things too, because she just can't die.
Yeah.
Well, and beyond that, she's also a member of the nobility, which I think kind of ties to the point that I think maybe as far as like wish fulfillment, it's interesting. I'm gonna see if I can land this one. I'm not 100% sure I can, but let's see. I would say that her wish is probably to establish her value as independent of her pedigree, if that makes sense. Now, as to how that is like subverted, I don't know. What do you all think? Maybe it's like,
I'm gonna push back on that a little bit because she's arguably like, I would say, the only one of them that doesn't really have like a well-defined wish. What you're saying right now like would make sense with the framework that has been presented, but everything that has been said so far and then like a little bit stuff afterwards, she only ever really had one kind of wish, but it wasn't relating to her pedigree.
could you unpack that wish?
Her main wish was basically, well, like I'll frame it like this: you're half right and half wrong. Half right because she did want to have like a normal life aside from just being a noble woman. She like did not like want that life. She wants to be an adventurer. But like her biggest thing her biggest wish, aside from that, was just wanting to be in a party with friends, having a friend.
So she's really seeking like an internal sense of like worth to a certain extent. But what she receives, and this is interesting, right? Because when she acts as a paladin and like fights and stuff, she is praised by others, for her quote unquote selfless actions, even though her motivation for them is actually totally selfish or self-interested, I should say, not selfish, self-interested.
No, also selfish.
It's interesting to note that contrast between external validation and internal validation, external worth attributed to her and internal worth, which is what she's seeking.
Good old Lalatina is a prime party member. The only thing I remember ever questioning really her about is at the beginning when she joined the party and she's like, yeah, I live in this mansion over here. And I'm just like, wait, why are Kozma and Aqua still sleeping in the stables? Can they not go live with darkness? Do party members not, like, share houses? I was like, I get it, it's for the comedy, but, like, come on, y'all. Like, I'm pretty sure darkness would allow it.
No, I think you're right to bring that up, too, considering in Season 1, once when they get that mansion, they all live together. So there was no reason for them to not live with darkness before that. Aside from
because she wasn't the party leader.
I guess. But I was confused. I was just like, well, if it's based on the party leader, why doesn't Darkness live in the stables? She would never do that, of course. But you know what I mean. It was just kind of like one of those. It was again one of those things where it's like, the consistency maybe of like certain, I don't want to say common sense because the joke is a lot of these characters are idiots, so like common sense doesn't really apply.
Yeah,
but sometimes they do think, and they're just like Kazuma's like, oh, why are we still living in the stables? This sucks. And I'm like, I don't know. You have this like paladin rich girl down the road who's like doesn't hate you. She actually likes you a lot. Why don't you go ask to live with her?
Wait.
Well, to be fair, they didn't know that she was a rich girl until later on.
I'm pretty sure they could figure out she had a house or something.
So on that note, I think let's put a cap on the discussion of darkness. Shall we quickly move to sort of assessing some of the supporting cast in a cursory manner? How's that sound?
Yeah.
All right, cool.
Ooh.
So everybody's favorite Soviet icon, aka YunYun. Let's talk about her.
YunYun.
Best girl. That's all I have to say. My 2 words. Best girl.
Anything else?
She's a more useful Megami than Megami.
And she's hilarious.
She is so the archetype mage.
Put me in this.
She can do advanced magic without passing out. She has a big heart. She's actually a good person just overall compared to everybody in the group.
Yeah, she's a friend. Put me in this world. You can be in my party, YunYun. I'll be your friend. It's okay.
Yeah, it never made sense to me why they wouldn't just invite her into the party aside from like comedy reasons. It wouldn't work.
All right.
Because she's too normal. I actually think Mother's Basement had a pretty good take on it. Like the farther away the girls are to Kazuma's like main circle, the more normal they are. As compared to the crazy that is Aqua, Darkness, and Megami. Like YunYun, great girl, normal girl. Whis, endearing, lovable. Chris, funny as shit, awesome. Eris is the polar opposite of Aqua. So the farther away you get from Kazuma and the 3 main girls, the more normal you get.
Yeah. Okay, speaking of Whis.
So I think Silver spoke to quite a few of the supporting cast members. Yeah, Whis.
Whis is fine. She's a little too... Oh, I'm the timid shopkeeper who's soft-spoken to, like, have that character archetype. But she's fine. She's fine. It's fine.
Yeah, and I would say there's a couple other, secondary characters that are quite interesting. Veneer is pretty interesting. He's
the masked dude, right?
Yeah, the masked gentleman.
Veneer, yeah.
He had a great episode, great introductions, good. Oh, let us not forget the Mohawk King, who's always just in the background. I don't remember his name or anything. My dude just...
I don't think they ever say his name, actually, now that I remember it. They don't say his name.
Buff dude. who just shows up sometimes, gives some commentary, leaves, and I'm just like, this man, he looks on with such like pride at Cosmo's party, and I'm just like, man, that dude is one of the, it's one of those things where it's like, if I was in this town and I went to the bar, I would just love to see like the faces of like, you know, the person who runs the adventuring quest lady person name, I don't know her name, or the Mohawk dude, or Cosmo's party's over there. Oh, and there's Mitsurugi. I will say the show did have the credit of like, you saw the same background characters over and over again, so it really did build the idea of a community, quote unquote.
Some good world building.
Yeah.
Oh,
Good town building.
if I may take a quick step back, it also just occurred into my head that our favorite girl YunYun is a bit of a foil for Megami, and that she actually is like a bit of she's like a proficient mage. She like doesn't really have like the delusions of grandeur that like Megami has. And interestingly enough, she also doesn't have a friend, which is like what Megami does have is like friends, if that makes sense. On that note, I think
easily.
Yeah, on that note, I think it probably makes sense to move to our next big topic, which is actually an interesting discussion that Silver and I have been carrying on for a little bit of some time now. It's about Konosuba and whether or not it's a parody or a satire. My take is pretty simple, I would say. I think there's a distinction between parody and satire. Parody is, how do I put it? I think one way to understand it is that it is like over exaggeration, or just like humorous, artful representation of let's see, a like, you know, a genre or what have you, but done so in like a loving way, you know, or done so in a way that doesn't fundamentally like, you know, critique the genre, or doesn't like fundamentally like undermine or try to communicate some truth about the real world, if that makes sense. So like Konosuba, you know, it's a parody. I would also say within parody it's a spoof. Spoof is like the genre specific version of parody, if that makes sense. So it's a spoof of isekai, because, you know, from the beginning we see things like for instance, the way that there's a bit of jovial, like poking fun at the truck-kun trope in isekai, or just the fact that, you know, Kazuma advances through the story basically, and his party basically through sheer luck, as distinguished from skill, and like being like overpowered in the sense of like skill. There's a number of other examples, I would say, such as like, you know, the party that Kazuma's a part of. It's not a particularly, you know, overpowered party. It's like a kind of cobbled together different, like, one could say tropes, but they're not like particularly like overpowered in any way. And yet I think this is what separates you know, Konosuba from the realm of like satire, is that they do like narratively speaking progress along the like, you know, typical like isekai like story path, you know. So they are defeating like the devil kings, like generals and whatnot. Like they are advancing through the story, whereas satire
Defeat.
Yeah, we can put air quotes around defeating. And then with satire, I think, so it's interesting to note that with satire, I recently learned this, and I think some of the linguistic confusion around satire might be attributable to the two different roots of like the word satire, or our common understanding of satire. One being like the Greek root, which is kind of connected to satyr plays, and these kind of plays poked fun at like figures in society, but like they were characterized mainly by like the rowdiness and like the bawdy nature of like the satyrs, which were these like kind of like mostly like, they were like mostly man, but with like a like horse's ears and tail figures that were like the followers of the Greek god of wine Dionysus. So it's interesting, like the like, yeah, so it's interesting the connection to like I guess like partying, because Dionysus is kind of like the god of like partying and like, you know, kind of like lightheartedness. And then on the other hand, there's the Roman definition of satire, which is like the definition of satire that I tend to be inclined towards, which is, basically the idea that satire, its function and what distinguishes it is the communication of a critical truth about like the real world, or about like I suppose in some sense, like one could say that like a genre satire is also connected to like, I don't know, could also be like connected in some ways to like a real world idea. I think of like, let's say, this actually allows me to unpack this a little bit more, but I think of like ReZero, and I think ReZero is interesting because ReZero, I think you probably have some folks who'd be willing to say that it's like a satire. I wouldn't say it's a satire. I would say that it's a like isekai with satirical elements. So for example, like the respawn mechanic in ReZero, you get a pretty grim portrait of what it would actually be like to have to like die over and over again and like respawn. And that's truer to the real world phenomenon of death. It's a truer representation of that, and it's a critique of like the kind of way in which like respawning might be seen in like an escapist like fantasy, if that makes sense. But it doesn't undermine like the notion of an escapist fantasy completely, which I think would be like the thing characterizing satire, like an isekai that is a satire. An undermining of like escapism would be one way of thinking about that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I guess coming from my perspective of haven't done too much study on this, but when I think of like just the like common lexicon use of like parody and satire in like the quote unquote general discourse, when I think of satire, it's usually something that takes apart the conventions of a medium, a genre, a whatever, in order to say something unseen or analyze something about those conventions itself. While a parody is more of a like taking those conventions, bringing them to the forefront of the entertainment itself. So in that sense, as you said, like I also started watching ReZero while also watching Konosuba, just because, well, from my perspective, I have watched them as isekai. So the traditional quote-unquote isekai genre conventions are only things I've heard of from people talking about how trash Sword Art Online is. So
Hell yeah.
When I think of like, as you said, ReZero, the whole respawn mechanic actually having this idea of like how traumatizing that could be, that's a satire like take on respawning. Like the idea of like, oh, being brought back to life later is still pretty traumatic because you're still getting killed over and over and over again. Whereas a parody, which is like what Konosuba does, I mean, they do mention at some point, Kozma, I think, says, or he doesn't say in the series, but he said in the movie, dying hurts. But before that, I was always just like, oh, he died, and it's hilarious that he keeps getting brought back to life. But it also kind of broke some parts for me, because I remember at the beginning of season 2 where it's like, oh, we might execute him. But in my head, I just kept thinking to myself like, well, wait, he can't really die. So what's the threat? I get this is hilarious, and it's pretty funny to see him freak out, and he doesn't want to die. But part of it was just like, oh, the respawning of Kozma is more of like, oh, here's something that happens in video games. We're going to make it comedic. We're not going to really say anything nuanced about it. So that's like my, I guess, distinction between satire and parody.
And for me, I might as well put this major to use, you know? But satire is simply like you bring up the idea, you bring up the problems, but then you actually say things should change. Like you bring up, say, hey, this ain't working out. I got a point to make. Let's actually show something. You know what I mean? While parody comes in and essentially just over exaggerates it, leaves it there on the fly, and doesn't mean it should change anything and things like that. And bringing this out to like other real world examples, we see Watchmen and something called The Boys. So in the superhero genre, this is like brought up all the time. So you see Watchmen counts as satire because it brings up real big issues in the superhero world and what should be changed. And then there's the one called The Boys. Yeah, and I hear it's like a satire. Is that like right?
Yeah, I would classify The Boys as a satire. This is not an endorsement of The Boys. It's pretty bare bones as a satire, but it's a satire because it still tries to quote unquote say something about the genre of superhero movies.
Can you really quickly unpack that?
Okay.
Oh, you're talking to me. Okay. When I say it was a bare bones unpacking of like the superhero genre, I know we're getting away from the topic. So The Boys basically is like, oh, what if superheroes actually existed in our corporate capitalist structure? So the Justice League, or their versions of the Justice League, is handled by a corporation. They have a PR firm. They select which crimes or which heroes are going to patrol what areas. There's a whole marketing team. There's a whole and then the heroes themselves, for the most part, are just, well, they're bad, they're terrible people, but they're just like, oh, I do this is my job. I just work, I get the praise, I do the endorsements, but I'm really in it for selfish reasons for myself. I don't really care about saving people so much. And you can see that, that sort of deconstruction of the archetypical, oh, I'm a superhero, I do good things because I want to save people and I'm a good person and setting an example, into more of the quote-unquote realistic and gritty version, to where the superheroes are no more good or bad than your average person in a high position of power. They are what do you call it? They have some monopoly on violence that other people don't have. Therefore, they use their monopoly on violence in ways that are shady and covered up by the company. The reason I said it's bare bones is The Boys kind of gets dragged along into being kind of super edgy a little bit too much, where it's get it? People are bad, and bad people do bad things, and life sucks, and people are bad, and I'm just okay, it wasn't anything I wouldn't get from something like Watchmen that is more smartly made, or anything else that maybe had more to say.
Okay, so I think there's the core of the one of the cores of the distinction is that there is a moral lesson, and there is an aspect of society that is being challenged, right? So there it's the dominant myth of the hero, if that makes sense, or the unquestioned authority figure that is benevolent, that is being challenged, that is somehow supposed to be, whether you want to call them the philosopher king or whatever, is supposed to somehow be above society, but acting in the interests of society. And there's a complete takedown. So that's I would say that that's more in accord with what I would declare as satire. And I think something folks brought up that's interesting is the distinction between something being classified as a satire, a work of art being classified as a satire, versus a work of art having satirical elements. And as far as I think that's my thoughts on Konosuba at the moment. It's I don't think there's an isekai that would qualify as a satire just yet. Again, Silver and I sort of discussed this, but I think probably what that might look
one
like.
That I can think of is what was it? Devil's a Part-Timer.
So I guess to sort of I don't necessarily feel equipped to comment on Devil's a Part-Timer at the current moment, but to sort of speak to what that might what a satire might look like. Silver and I had this discussion. And I think, you'd have to get something like Don Quixote, aka made into an isekai. So the notion, so for folks that aren't familiar with Don Quixote, read it. It's one of the greatest novels of all time. The idea of it is you have this gentleman, he basically is just a regular old guy, and he goes crazy. And he basically thinks of himself as being in a fantasy world, and he finds he thinks of himself as a knight named Don Quixote, and he finds an assistant, and the assistant is a squire, but the squire is this poor guy that rides a donkey, and this poor fat guy that rides a donkey, and they go around, and he falls in love with this girl that he thinks is a princess, but actually the girl is a prostitute, and just a bad person, because I want to differentiate between those two things very explicitly, because they definitely don't go hand in hand, and there's a series of social baggage with associating them that I want to disentangle myself from. But the whole point of it is that and there's this very famous scene where he thinks he's fighting a dragon, but he's really fighting a windmill.
Yeah, it's where the term tilting at windmills comes from.
Exactly. And so it's the idea that escaping from like reality is like it's diluted, it's crazy, something like that potentially is what an isekai that is a satire might do, if that makes sense, to communicate that truth. Like the notion of like escapism is foolhardy. If you think you can escape, yeah, go ahead.
This idea is of the idea of a satire of an isekai would be something where escaping into another world where things might seem better is ultimately not good for you. You should learn to deal with your issues. Is handled expertly in the Game Boy Advance game Final Fantasy Tactics Advanced. It's a spin-off of already a spin-off. It was something I played as a child that at the time I didn't understand, because the main characters can basically get transported to the Final Fantasy world, and like, for example, there's a character who's in a wheelchair who can walk in this world, and like you play the main character who's always like, guys, we should go back to the human world, but all his friends are living quote unquote better lives. And then the whole time I remember as a kid being like, yeah, the guy I'm playing with I kind of don't like, he's kind of ruining people. But then as I got older and then I've watched some analysis on it, it's actually like, yeah, wait a minute, this stuff isn't real though. Like escaping into a fantasy world, even if things are quote unquote better, is not healthy for you. You need to learn to confront your demons, quote unquote, or even just accept some parts of reality in the real world and make yourself a better person rather than looking for a constant escape. So if anyone wants to get into Final Fantasy Tactics Advance on the GBA, there you go. There's your satire isekai, boys.
Okay, and for another good example, y'all might hate me for this, but let's go back in time and we're gonna look at Spy Kids 3 as the isekai satire that we need.
I feel like my third eye
Think about it.
I can
Our boy
see
goes into the game because he's
waves
trying to
of-
escape real life. He then learns the lesson that he needs to leave because the problems are actually still in the real life, because he lost his girlfriend. The main hero dies in the game. Like, Spy Kids 3 was really onto something. They really were.
I just want to point out that a satire of isekai, specifically because isekai is an anime thing, it's an anime genre. I've only ever heard it referred to anime. It's Japanese, at least I think so. I'll look that up. The idea of going to another world is not new. Like, as you said, Don Quixote before, even though it's all in its own head, but we have things in the West such as Chronicles of Narnia, Peter Pan, all that. But a specific satire of isekai has to do more than just, going to this other world, going to a fantasy world, this other place is not as good as you think it is. It's bad. There are specific traits, I think, that pertain to the anime version of the quote-unquote going to another world that, when looking at something to qualify as that satire of that, it has to hit more of those specific tropes than just, another world not as grand and great as you think it is.
転んですりむいたとこ血がにじんでしみるけれど
Yo everybody, Bass here. As with always with these type of announcements, just letting you know that this is part 1 of our 2-part discussion on Konosuba Season 1 and Season 2. Stick around and part 2 will be released shortly, and also a special done concurrently with the Konosuba movie. Hope you guys are all staying safe out there and enjoying yourselves during these troubling times in the world. You can follow us on Twitter at BoysAnime, that is at BoyZanime, at BoysAnime. Get all of our hot takes and spicy opinions. As always, peace, love, swag.
南